Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are stepping into what sounds like, well, the ultimate philosophical adventure. A promise of absolute certainty, a kind of newly discovered land, this infinite field of transcendental experience. It offers that kind of rock-solid, indubitable knowledge philosophers have been chasing forever.
That's definitely the allure, isn't it? The gravitational pull of Edmund Husserl's Transcendental Phenomenology. When you read the source material about his goals, you really feel it. It's this promise of not just an idea, but a rigorous method, one designed to reveal the true essences of things in, pure, absolute self-evidence. It's meant to be the ultimate foundation for knowledge.
And the power of his project, the reason it hit so hard in the early 20th century, is that this promised land isn't out there somewhere mystical. It's supposed to be immediately available to you, the listener.
Right here.
Right here in your own consciousness. It's profoundly intuitive, conceptually beautiful even.
It is beautifully structured, I agree. But here's the twist, and this is really the focus of our depth dive today. We're looking at a pretty powerful critique, arguing that while Husserl's method is elegant and it feels coherent, its very foundation has this, potentially fatal flaw.
Flaw in the foundation.
Specifically, its key theory of consciousness, what he called intentionality, seems to ultimately undermine the very certainty it was built to guarantee.
So it's a kind of philosophical paradox then.
Yeah.
The main tool he designed to build this unshakable foundation actually ends up, causing it to crumble?
That's the argument we're exploring. And to really get why this is such a big deal, we need to understand the stakes for Husserl. His whole mission, his central drive, was establishing this absolute grounding for knowledge.
Right.
And that grounding depended entirely on two absolutely critical concepts: truth and a very specific kind of realism.
Okay, truth and realism, got it.
Exactly. And the critique basically says, look, Husserl's own brilliant theory of intentionality, arguably his biggest contribution, actually makes these two concepts, truth and realism, deeply problematic. Maybe even impossible within his own system.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds like an epic philosophical tragedy in the making. Let's definitely unpack this. We should probably start by grounding ourselves in Husserl's motivations, why he was so driven to find this absolute certainty.
Good idea. His why.
Then we'll dig into the method itself, the phenomenological reduction, this idea of absolute givenness. After that, we need a close look at the critique, the argument about intentionality.
And finally, the fallout. The potential collapse.
Exactly. The devastating philosophical consequences if the critique holds water. Right, let's start there then. Section 9. Husserl's pursuit of absolute grounding. This wasn't just some abstract academic game for him, was it? This quest for certainty.
Oh, not at all. Not in the slightest. Husserl really saw his work as a direct, urgent response to what he perceived as a deep foundational crisis. It was gripping both the natural sciences and philosophy around the turn of the century.
A crisis, how so?
Well, science was obviously making huge strides, but he felt its underlying concepts weren't rigorously examined. They were a bit shaky philosophically. And philosophy itself, he thought it was completely adrift.
Adrift.
Yeah, lacking what he called objectively valid results, just endless debates without real progress. Philosophy was suffering, in his view, from a crisis of confidence, a crisis of method.
So he steps onto the scene, almost like a rescuer, trying to complete what Descartes started. Descartes had the cogito right, I think, therefore I am, that one point of certainty.
Precisely. He saw Descartes as having found the starting point, the cogito, the undeniable fact of one's own existence as a thinking thing. But Husserl thought, okay, that's the anchor, but we need to build the entire structure of objective knowledge on something just as secure or even more secure.
And how do you even begin that if you can't trust previous philosophy?
His demand was incredibly strict. A truly rigorous philosophy, he argued, has to begin without any presuppositions whatsoever.
Not at all.
Not even presupposing that absolute grounding is possible. You have to demonstrate everything right from the ground up, from scratch. This absolute rigor is crucial for understanding how he defines things next.
Okay, so that leads us to his definition of grounding. If you can't presuppose anything, how do you justify any claim? What's the most basic validation?
Well, he says grounding a judgment simply means basing it on evidence. It sounds intuitive, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
We ground our claims when we can point to the thing itself, when we can see it. Husserl defines evidence quite directly as a mental seeing of something itself. It's that moment of direct, unmediated grasp.
But, okay, if we're aiming for this ultimate certainty, the kind needed to rebuild all of philosophy from the ground up, surely the evidence needs to be stronger than just, seeing a cat on a mat.
Absolutely. It can't just be ordinary evidence. It has to be apodictic.
Apodictic. That's a key term here, isn't it?
A crucial one. Apodictic means necessarily certain, beyond any possible doubt, even if you actively try your hardest to doubt it. It has to withstand any attempt at skeptical demolition.
Wow.
And this evidence, this apodictic evidence, must also be first in itself, meaning it has to be self-sufficiently given. It doesn't rely on anything else for its certainty. This is what I mean by absolutely given.
Absolutely given.
And if something is absolutely given, it follows that it must be indubitable. It cannot possibly be corrected or overturned by any later experience or judgment. It's final.
Okay, let's pause on indubitable for a second, because often in philosophy, the search for absolute indubitability leads you down a rabbit hole, maybe even away from reality entirely. How did Husserl keep a connection to, knowledge about things while demanding this level of certainty?
That's a great question. He did it by focusing the indubitability inward onto the conscious act itself. So if I say, there's a red coffee cup on my desk, I could be wrong, right? The lighting might be weird. Maybe I'm dreaming. Maybe it's actually orange. That judgment about the external cup is contingent, possibly false.
Sure.
But what I cannot possibly doubt, Husserl argues, is the conscious act of experiencing redness right now. The claim, I am currently having an experience that I interpret as seeing red, that claim, focused purely on the internal event, is indubitable.
Ah, I see. So the object of that experience, the redness is experienced. When you bracket out the external world aspect, that becomes the absolutely given data point for phenomenology.
Exactly. That internal content is the secure starting point.
Okay, that makes sense for achieving certainty. But if the foundation is purely internal, purely within consciousness, how does he then support the kind of objective standards you need for a system of knowledge? You mentioned truth and realism earlier. How do those fit in if everything is internal?
He connects them directly to this absolutely given conscious data. First, truth. He actually uses the classical correspondence theory.
The old adequatio rei et intellectus.
That's the one. The agreement or adequacy between the thought intellectus and the thing or object, rei. Now, in phenomenology, the intellectus is the detailed description the phenomenologist produces.
Okay.
And the rei, the thing it has to correspond to, is the absolutely given conscious content, the essence we were just talking about, like the experienced redness.
So, for phenomenology to work as a science, the descriptions must be capable of being judged true or false based on how well they match up with these internal, absolutely given contents.
Precisely. The description has to be adequate to the phenomenon itself.
Got it. Now, what about the other one, realism? You mentioned this is where the critique starts to gain traction, and it's not the usual, is the external world real kind of realism.
Right. This is a really critical point, and we need to be super clear on it. The critique we're discussing uses a specific understanding of realism, drawing a bit from philosophers like Michael Dummett. It's about whether statements concerning a certain class of things possess bivalence.
Bivalence, meaning they have to be either true or false.
Right.
No third option, no fuzziness.
Exactly that. So realism, in this context, means that statements made about the essential structures of consciousness, about this phenomenological data we've been discussing, must be strictly either true or false.
Okay.
And this is the crucial part. Their truth value, whether they are true or false, must exist independently of whether we, the phenomenologists, can actually confirm it or even describe it perfectly. There has to be a fact of the matter about consciousness itself.
Can we use an analogy? Like if a standard realist says there's a gold coin at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, they're saying that statement is either true or false right now, even if we can never get down there to check. The truth exists independently of our knowing it.
That's a perfect analogy. So for Husserl's project, the Mariana Trench is the realm of absolutely given conscious data. Realism, in this specific sense, means that this data has a definite, fixed structure and objective fact of the matter. And a phenomenological description of that structure is therefore either true or false, based purely on whether it accurately captures that independent structure, even if the phenomenologist writing the description hasn't quite nailed it yet.
Okay, the implication there is huge, isn't it? Because if that internal fact of the matter about consciousness doesn't exist independently,
then the whole idea of correspondence truth just collapses.
Because there's nothing definite for the description to correspond to.
Exactly. These two pillars, Truth as correspondence and realism as the independent bivalence of statements about conscious data, they are the absolute driving forces behind Husserl's entire foundational project. And they hinge completely on the genuine possibility of accessing data that is truly, unequivocally, absolutely given.
Okay, so if the whole project demands this absolute givenness, the next logical step is to understand the method, the rigorous tool Husserl developed to actually get there. Which brings us to section 2, the phenomenological method reduction and absolute givenness.
Right. And as we touched on, it builds from the ego, that indubitable I am point he inherited from Descartes. But Husserl quickly realized that just knowing I exist is, well, it's pretty thin soup if you want to build a whole system of knowledge.
That much content there.
Not enough. He needed to dramatically expand the zone of certainty.
And he did that by extending the indubitable basis, not just to the I think, but to the entire field of conscious experience itself.
Yes, exactly. Think about the difference. Descartes was certain that he existed as a thinking thing. Husserl says, look, the entire flow of my conscious life, my perceptions, memories, judgments, emotions, the whole stream is immediately available to me with absolute certainty as phenomena.
How so?
Well, take perception again. I might perceive a tree outside my window, and maybe that tree isn't really there. Maybe it's a hallucination. But Husserl insists it remains absolutely clear and certain that with respect to perception, I am perceiving this or that. The act of perceiving and the content as perceived, the tree experience, are undeniably present to me in a way that is self-validating. They are given.
So every single conscious experience, when we strip it down and focus purely on the internal act and its content, becomes an instance of absolute givenness.
That's the claim. This whole realm of conscious acts and their contents forms a new field of being, the transcendental realm, which, unlike the natural world, is supposedly non-contingent and utterly indubitable.
Okay, but our everyday attention isn't usually focused inward like that, is it? We're normally focused on the things out there, the tree, the desk, the world. How do we shift our focus purely onto this inner, supposedly indubitable realm?
That requires the crucial methodological step, the famous or perhaps infamous phenomenological reduction, often called the epiche.
The epiche, the bracketing.
Exactly. Now, it's often misunderstood. People sometimes think it means denying the existence of the external world.
Right, like solipsism.
But it's not that. It's not an ontological claim about what exists. It's a methodological suspension. It's about bracketing or putting aside our ordinary natural beliefs about the world in order to focus purely on the phenomena as given in consciousness. Husserl needs to exclude everything that is transcendent meaning, anything that isn't entirely immanent within consciousness itself from his philosophical starting point.
So what specifically gets bracketed or excluded?
Two main things are crucial here. First, any and all suppositions about the actual contingent existence or non-existence of the external natural world. The phenomenologist doesn't assume the desk is real, but crucially, they don't assume it's not real either. They just suspend judgment on its status beyond experience.
Okay, suspend judgment on the outside world. What's the second thing?
The second exclusion is just as critical, maybe even more so, for understanding phenomenology's unique position. He excludes all suppositions that conscious phenomena are merely functions of an individual biological organism living in the natural world.
And that's why phenomenology insists it's not just descriptive psychology, right?
Precisely. If my conscious experience of red were simply a result of neurons firing in my brain or my evolutionary history, then it would be a contingent fact of the natural world. It would be subject to natural laws, cause and effect.
And therefore not absolutely certain or foundational in the way he needs.
Exactly. It couldn't provide that apodictic, absolute certainty required for the foundation. So the reduction is designed to liberate the phenomena from their presumed naturalistic origins and causes, allowing us to examine them in their pure, transcendental form as structures of consciousness itself.
So performing the reduction facilitates a shift in attitude. We move from what he calls the natural attitude,
which is concerned with everyday contingent matters of fact, like, is that tree really there?
To the phenomenological attitude. And this attitude is concerned solely with what he calls universal essences or eidetic essence.
Yes, the eidos. This transition from the fleeting contingent mental event to the fixed necessary essence embedded within it is really the heart of the positive phenomenological method. How do we get from the particular experience to the universal structure?
Okay, let's use his famous example. Perceiving the color red. How do we get the essence of red from just looking at something red?
Right. So imagine you're looking at, say, a piece of red blotting paper on your desk. In the natural attitude, your perception is tied up with the contingent facts. This paper, this lighting, my current viewpoint, etc.
Okay.
Now, you perform the epicé. You bracket the actual material existence of the blotting paper, its specific location, the physical properties of the light. You suspend judgment on all that contingent stuff. What's left?
What remains purely within the conscious experience itself.
Exactly. What remains, Husserl argues, after you've stripped away all the contingent matter-of-factness, is the essence. This species red. The pure whatness of red as it presents itself intentionally in your consciousness.
So this species red isn't tied to the paper anymore. It's the intentional content, the way redness appears.
Precisely. And this content, this essence, he argues, is fixed and ideal. He uses the term irreal, which sounds a bit strange.
Irreal.
Yeah, it doesn't mean unreal in the sense of fake. It means non-spatiotemporal, like mathematical objects or logical propositions. The number 2 isn't located anywhere in space or time, but it's a fixed, objective entity in some sense.
Okay, so these essences are ideal, like numbers.
Yes, but they are real in the crucial sense that they exist as objective, fixed structures or contents within the transcendental realm of consciousness available for inspection.
This sounds structurally very similar to ideas in logic, like Frege's distinction between sense and reference. Is that a helpful comparison?
It's an extremely helpful analogy, and Husserl was deeply engaged with logic. Think about it. A logician studies the sense or propositional content of a statement, like the current king of France is bald.
Okay, a statement that refers to nothing real.
Right. That proposition has a definite, fixed sense or meaning, even though there is no actual king of France, and therefore the statement lacks a real-world truth value, or is false. The sense itself is invariant.
I see.
Husserl is doing something analogous for consciousness. He's concerned solely with the invariant contents and structures of intentional experience, the essences, ignoring their contingent connection to actual objects or their truth value as statements about the external world.
Okay, so by performing the reduction and focusing on these essences, he believes he's isolated these ideal fixed structures entirely within consciousness, and these are the absolutely given data points.
That's the claim. By establishing these intentional contents, the essences, as ideal, fixed, and entirely immanent to consciousness, he believes he has finally secured the necessary conditions for his foundation.
How so?
Because these essences, being supposedly absolutely given, now serve as the stable, independent the thing or object for the descriptive thought intellectus to correspond to.
Ah, so this secures both pillars.
That's the idea. It secures realism because the essence of redness is what it is, fixed and independent of how perfectly my description captures it. And it secures truth because a genuine correspondence between my description and that fixed essence is now, at least in principle, possible.
So at this point in his project, Husserl must have felt he'd really done it, solved philosophy's foundational crisis.
You have to imagine so. It's an incredibly elegant and powerful construction. It seems to offer exactly what he set out to find. A realm of absolute certainty accessible through rigorous method.
Okay, but here's where the deep dive gets, well, critical. We arrive at section 3, the critique. This is where the argument emerges that Husserl's greatest achievement, his theory of intentionality, is actually the very thing that unravels this beautiful foundation.
Exactly. It's a profound internal challenge. Let's start by making sure we really grasp Husserl's concept of intentionality, especially what the critique calls the adverbial account.
Right. Intentionality. The idea that consciousness is always consciousness of something.
That's the core, yes. Husserl's central insight, building on Brentano, is that all our mental acts, perceiving, judging, desiring, remembering, are inherently directed towards an object. But crucially, he argues that all concepts that have meaning for us, knowledge, truth, the external world itself, ultimately derive their sense from these directed intentional acts.
Okay. And the critical feature for this critique is how these acts relate to their objects. You said they are a priori directed.
Yes, and that the intentional object becomes immanently present within the act itself, precisely because of the specific way the act directs itself towards it.
Immanently present, meaning inside the act.
In a way, yes. The adverbial interpretation really emphasizes the mode or manner of consciousness. When I see a tree, I'm not just passively receiving sense data. I am actively seeing treely. When I am thinking about a complex mathematical proof, I am judging mathematically. The specific character or structure of the conscious act itself is what constitutes the object as intended, as present within consciousness.
Okay, the example used in the source material, thinking about the mythical god Jupiter, seems really helpful here.
It's perfect, isn't it? Because Jupiter, the Roman god, obviously doesn't exist out there in the physical world.
Right.
But the act of thinking Jupiterly, imagining his beard, his thunderbolts, whatever that act, is a real, occurrent, conscious experience. It's a definite, particular mode of mindedness. And the intentional object, Jupiter as thought of, is present within that act, entirely constituted by the way the act is structured and directed.
So the intentional object is, as the source says, wholly determined by the way they are being directed to.
Exactly. The what that is present in consciousness is determined by the how of the conscious act.
Okay, hang on a second. If the object, the intentional content, the rest that truth was supposed to correspond to, if that's wholly determined by the conscious act directing itself, doesn't that sound more like the act is constructing the object rather than discovering something that's just given? If the act itself shapes or defines the content, how can that content possibly be absolute given, meaning present independently of the act that constitutes it?
You've hit the absolute core of the philosophical tension that this critique drills down on. It seems like there's a fundamental incompatibility brewing here.
Right.
But before diving straight into that core dilemma, the critique first needs to clear the ground by addressing different kinds of skepticism, specifically by reintroducing what it calls ontological skepticism.
Okay, the source mentioned a distinction made by Sorbonne. There's epistemological skepticism.
Which is basically the worry that consciousness changes so fast, maybe we can never be sure our description accurately captures the phenomenon. It's a problem of certainty or adequacy of the description.
Right. And then there's ontological skepticism. What's that?
This is presented as the deeper, more fundamental threat. Ontological skepticism questions whether there's actually any absolute givenness there in the first place underlying the description.
So it's not just, can we describe it right?
Yeah.
But is there even a stable it's to describe?
Exactly. The worry is that the data itself might lack that fixed, independent fact of the matter that realism, in that specific bivalent sense, requires. And if it lacks that, then our phenomenological description, no matter how carefully done, might just be, well, a reflection of our own subjective beliefs or biases about what we think we're experiencing, not a report of something objectively given.
The source says Sorbonne tried to dismiss this worry.
Yeah, Sorbonne apparently argued that this kind of ontological skepticism mistakenly treats the phenomena as if they were objectively existing realities out there in the world, which is exactly what Husserl's reduction was designed to eliminate.
Makes sense.
But the critic argues that this completely misses the crucial point. The ontological worry here is not about whether phenomena correspond to external reality. Husserl bracketed that. The worry is about whether the intentional acts themselves, the very data of phenomenology within consciousness, are absolutely given and independent.
Ah, so the realism question applied internally to the conscious acts.
Precisely. If phenomenology aims to be a rigorous science providing foundational knowledge, then its own data, the intentional acts and their essential structures, must have that bivalent character. They must be what they are, independent of how the phenomenologist happens to describe them at any given moment. The whole project rests, as the critique puts it, on the reality of this absolute givenness.
Okay, so if that internal reality, that absolute givenness of the acts, is questionable, then we run headlong into what the critique calls the intentional construct problem.
This is the crux of it. It poses the dilemma starkly. How can anything be considered absolutely given to consciousness, meaning present independently for inspection, if that very thing, the intentional object or content, is essentially an intentional construct?
A construct.
Yeah, something whose entire mode of presentation, its very character as given, is determined by the way consciousness directs itself, by the intentional act itself. It seems the independence required for realism and for truth as correspondence is being fundamentally undermined by the very mechanism intentionality that Husserl identified as the essence of consciousness.
It really does feel like a vicious circle, doesn't it? To get the absolute foundation, Husserl needs absolutely given data. But his own definition of how consciousness works seems to imply that whatever data we access is necessarily conditioned, maybe even created, by the way we access it through intentional acts.
It's a powerful challenge. Now, the immediate Husserlian response, the likely defense, would be to say, wait, we're getting confused. Phenomenology isn't primarily about describing the object of the act, like Jupiter or the red blotting paper.
Okay.
It's about describing the intentional act itself, the act of seeing redly or thinking Jupiterly. And that act, in its immediate occurrence, is absolutely given. We're describing the structures of the act, not necessarily the object.
Okay, so the focus shifts to the act itself as the given thing. Does that save the project?
Well, this is where the critique makes its final and arguably most elegant and damaging move. It points to the self-referential trap of reflection.
The self-referential trap. Okay, what does that mean?
It's a really subtle but profound point. How does the phenomenologist actually study these intentional acts? They can't just happen and be instantly known in their essence. You need to turn your attention towards them.
Right, you need to reflect on them.
Exactly. The method relies on transcendental reflection, the act of the phenomenologist turning their gaze, their attention, back onto their own stream of conscious acts. That's how you identify the structures.
Makes sense.
But here's the trap. As soon as the phenomenologist directs his regard, as Husserl puts it, towards some initial intentional act, like the act of seeing red, what happens? That initial act, the one being studied, itself becomes the intentional object of the new second-order act, the act of reflection.
Whoa! Okay, so the very act of observing the first act turns that first act into an object for the observing act.
Precisely. And if it becomes an intentional object,
then, according to the theory of intentionality itself, it's now being constituted, shaped, determined by the way the reflective act is directed towards it.
you got it. The intentional act that was supposed to be the pristine, absolutely given data point gets immediately transformed and potentially distorted the moment you try to grasp it through reflection. Its givenness becomes conditioned by the very act of observing it.
It really is like the observer effect in physics, isn't it? Where measuring something inevitably disturbs it. But here it's happening right inside consciousness itself.
It's a powerful analogy. If I try to reflect purely on, say, a feeling of annoyance I had a moment ago, the instant I turn my full analytical attention onto that feeling,
It changes.
it almost inevitably changes. Either the raw feeling is replaced by a cooler analytical distance as I dissect it, or the act of focusing on it might even intensify or reshape the annoyance itself. It's no longer the original raw givenness.
So the modification seems unavoidable if reflection is intentional.
It seems unavoidable according to Husserl's own theory of intentionality. And the critical question then becomes devastating. How can the phenomenologist ever be truly sure that their description of an intentional act's essence isn't just, quote, pure confabulation? Meaning, how can they distinguish between accurately describing the act as it was, or as its essence truly is, versus simply projecting onto it what their theory or their reflective intention expects or wants to find there?
Wow. So the very method needed to access the indubitable reflection seems to introduce fundamental doubt by altering the data it seeks to capture purely. The fight against subjective bias seems to reappear right at the heart of the supposedly pure transcendental ego.
That's the core of the critique. It suggests this deep, perhaps insurmountable internal contradiction.
Okay, if reflection fundamentally alters the data, then the consequences for Husserl's entire project seem pretty dire. This brings us to section 4, the devastating repercussions.
Indeed. And what's really striking, almost poignant here, is that Husserl himself wasn't entirely blind to this problem.
He wasn't. He knew reflection was problematic.
To some extent, yes. In works like his Cartesian Meditations, he actually acknowledges quite openly that transcendental reflection modifies the phenomenological data that is being reflected on. He sees that the reflective act isn't perfectly transparent.
That seems like a massive admission for a project that absolutely depends on indubitable and absolutely given data. How on earth could he defend the project if he admitted the method itself modifies the data?
Well, he tried to sort of downplay it, minimize the damage. He suggests, essentially, that this modification is just the natural way introspection works. It's true of every reflection, including natural reflection, he says. The implication seems to be, okay, it happens, but that's just the nature of looking inward, so we carry on carefully anyway.
But the critique argues this allowance, this sort of natural modification defense, is actually ultimately devastating. Why? Why can't we just accept that reflection modifies things slightly and proceed with caution?
Because the entire premise, the non-negotiable starting point, was the need for data that is apodictic, absolutely certain, and absolutely given, presented purely without mediation. If the only way to access the supposedly pure data through reflection inevitably modifies it,
then the data you actually end up describing is no longer purely or absolutely given.
Exactly. It's necessarily a composite. It's a mixture of whatever the original phenomenon might have been, plus the unavoidable intrusion and shaving effect of the observer's reflective act. The moment you concede any modification by the act of observation, you've reintroduced doubt and contingency right back into the heart of the absolute foundation.
The foundation dissolves at the very point you try to touch it.
Precisely. The access method undermines the purity of the access data.
And this seems to directly challenge that ideal Husserl had of the phenomenologist, achieving the stance of a completely disinterested onlooker.
Yes, that ideal observer. Husserl seemed to need the ego to somehow split itself. One part undergoes the experiences, the flow of intentional acts, while another part stands back, purely passive, just watching and recording, like a perfect mirror.
Just observing without interfering.
Right. But the critique raises serious doubts about whether this disinterested onlooker stance is even philosophically coherent, let alone achievable.
How so? If I'm truly, utterly passive and disinterested, how do I then manage to generate an active description? Phenomenology isn't just passive staring. It involves intense analysis, comparison, finding essences, articulating them in precise language.
Exactly. To analyze, to categorize variations, to grasp an eidos, and then to express it linguistically, that requires complex, active, intentional thought processes. It involves judgment, synthesis, selection. It is emphatically not just a passive state of being that somehow magically reveals truth without effort.
It's work.
It's definitely work. And if generating the description requires these active, intentional modes of thought, then the phenomenologist is, by definition, operating within the realm of active intentionality, which, as we've just established, seems to inevitably modify the data being described.
So the phenomenologist seems trapped, don't they? Either they remain perfectly passive and disinterested, in which case they can't actually do phenomenology and produce descriptions,
or they become active in order to analyze and describe, but in doing so, they necessarily engage their own intentionality, which then interferes with and modifies the supposedly absolutely given content they were trying to capture purely.
The whole idea of the transcendental ego as this pure, detached spectator standing apart from the stream of its own intentional acts starts to look very shaky indeed.
Highly questionable, yes. And if the possibility of achieving that disinterested stance evaporates, then the internal contradiction highlighted by the critique seems complete, and the foundational pillars start to tumble.
Okay, let's trace those final consequences then. If we accept the critique, if absolute givenness turns out to be a kind of illusion, a fiction constructed by the reflective intentional act itself, what breaks?
Well, first and foremost, realism collapses. That specific Demetian-style realism about the phenomenological data.
Meaning the idea that statements about conscious essences are objectively true or false, independent of us.
Exactly. Without access to genuinely, absolutely given, fixed contents, the independent rays, there's simply no longer an objective fact of the matter about the essential structure of consciousness for our descriptions to be measured against. We lose the basis for bivalence. If the data itself is fluid, constantly being shaped by the very act of trying to describe it,
then there's no stable it for the description to be true of.
Precisely. Nothing objectively determines whether one phenomenologist's account is more adequate than another's, if both are potentially just reflections of their own reflective process.
And if there's no objective standard of adequacy, what is the description then? Is it just subjective?
The critique suggests it becomes effectively indistinguishable from mere confabulation. It might sound rigorous, it might use the complex language of phenomenology, but it lacks objective grounding. It's subjectivity pretending to be objectivity. The very rigor Husserl sought seems to implode because the subject can never truly step outside itself to check its findings against an independent reality, even an internal one.
And it seems obvious, but if realism collapses in this way,
then truth collapses right alongside it. Almost immediately.
Because the correspondence theory needs two independent things to correspond.
Exactly. The whole conception of truth as adequatio re et intellectus becomes impossible. There is no stable, independently given res, the fixed intentional content or act, for the intellectus, the phenomenological description, to accurately correspond to. The description is chasing a moving target that it itself is causing to move.
Wow. So the entire grand project, that incredibly ambitious search for absolute grounding that began with the strictest possible demands for certainty and evidence, it seems to ultimately fail because of the internal dynamics of Husserl's own revolutionary theory of consciousness.
That's the tragic irony presented by the critique. His most powerful tool, intentionality, becomes the instrument of the foundation's undoing.
This has been, well, an incredibly detailed and frankly pretty brutal dissection of what seems like a core internal paradox in Husserl's phenomenology. He sets out for the ultimate foundation.
The bedrock of certainty.
But his own magnificent, highly influential theory of intentionality seems to sabotage the very possibility of the absolute givenness that the foundation absolutely required to stand firm.
It really highlights the immense difficulty, maybe even the impossibility, of achieving the kind of absolute philosophical certainty he envisioned. His proposed solution to the foundational crises gripping philosophy and science, this radical turn inward to pure consciousness, appears, according to this critique, to introduce a profound ontological skepticism right at the very heart of where he needed absolute assurance.
So if the foundations really do collapse under this critique, what's left for phenomenology as a philosophical project? Does the critique just leave it in ruins, or does it suggest any way forward?
Thankfully, it doesn't just tear things down. The critique we've been examining does gesture towards a couple of possible paths, ways phenomenology might try to salvage itself or reorient its goals.
Okay, what are the options?
Well, the first path is, let's be honest, the most difficult one. It would involve trying to demonstrate that absolute givenness is possible after all, despite the self-referential trap of reflection we discussed.
How could that even work?
The critic acknowledges this would likely require, quote, a very different theory of intentionality. You'd need a new model of consciousness, a new understanding of reflection, one that somehow allows the reflective act to grasp or register the original intentional content without fundamentally conditioning or modifying it in the process.
That sounds incredibly difficult, like trying to invent a form of observation that has zero effect on the observed, which seems to run counter to what we discussed about intentionality itself.
It seems philosophically very, very challenging, yes. Given the depth and elegance of the critique based on Husserl's own premises, that path looks extremely arduous, maybe even blocked.
Okay, so if proving absolute givenness seems unlikely, what's the second option?
The second path is perhaps more pragmatic, more achievable, though it comes at a cost. It involves abandoning the original, extremely demanding criteria of absolute foundations altogether.
Giving up on apodictic certainty.
Essentially, yes. And adopting different, perhaps less stringent standards for what counts as truth and realism within phenomenology.
And what might that look like? If you give up on absolute correspondence to a perfectly given essence, what kind of truth are you left with?
The suggestion leans towards something like an intersubjective theory of truth.
Intersubjective.
Yeah.
Meaning based on agreement between people.
Exactly. If the individual phenomenologist, locked within their own reflective consciousness, cannot guarantee absolute, indubitable truth through pure self-evidence, perhaps a form of truth or validity can be established through agreement, through phenomenological consensus.
So multiple trained phenomenologists would investigate the same essential structures, like perception or time consciousness, compare their detailed descriptions, refine them through dialogue,
and the truth would emerge from that shared, coherent understanding that withstands mutual critique and refinement. It requires accepting a lower standard of certainty, doesn't it? Prioritizing shared coherence and replicability over absolute, individual proof.
This shift away from absolute certainty towards intersubjective agreement.
Yeah.
It raises a really powerful final thought, something for you, the listener, to really chew on based on everything we've dug into today.
Which is?
If phenomenology has to ultimately rely on consensus, on agreement between researchers, rather than on that original promise of indubitable, absolute self-evidence accessible to the individual, what ultimately is lost?
That's a deep question. If the goal shifts from uncovering the absolute, necessary, timeless structure of consciousness itself to finding a shared, agreed-upon, perhaps historically situated structure of consciousness, what really distinguishes phenomenology, then, from a very sophisticated form of descriptive psychology? Or maybe even an advanced sociology of conscious experience?
Right. Does it retain its unique philosophical claim to foundational knowledge? And perhaps stepping back even further, can any philosophical quest truly achieve an absolute ground if the very act of seeking that ground, the very methods we use to investigate, inevitably seem to change the terrain we're exploring?
It's a question that echoes far beyond just Husserl, doesn't it? It touches on the very nature and limits of philosophical inquiry itself. Even when certainty seems to crumble, the questions just keep getting deeper.
An idea that definitely proves that. Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating and quite challenging deep dive into the crisis of absolute givenness in Husserl's phenomenology.
My pleasure. It's a truly